The work begins at dusk, when the heat recedes into the earth and the shadows lengthen, stretching across the trench until all that remains is the focused glow of a work light. Here, history is not read in books, but in the patient removal of dust, one layer at a time. The only sounds are the scrape of a trowel against compacted soil and the low, persistent whisper of the wind moving across the flatlands of what was once Sumer. An archaeologist kneels, their form silhouetted against the deepening twilight, a custodian at the threshold of forgotten time. They are not searching for treasure or for a specific artifact. They are simply moving downward through the accumulated debris of millennia, listening to the story the ground itself has to tell. Each layer is a sentence, each fragment a word. But sometimes the earth simply falls silent, and that silence is where our story begins, deep beneath the foundations of the first recorded cities. Several meters below the lowest stones of Eridu, the most ancient of cities, the tool makes a different sound. The soil's texture changes. It is no longer the familiar mix of sand, decomposed brick, and organic matter that marks human settlement. Instead, what emerges under the light is a thick, uniform stratum of clay. It is smooth, dense, and utterly consistent, a clean, unbroken line drawn across the timeline of the Earth. The researcher pauses, their work shifting from excavation to documentation. They measure its depth, take samples of its composition, and map its precise location in the stratigraphy of the site. There is no drama in this moment, only the quiet, methodical process of recording an anomaly. This layer does not belong here. It is an interruption, a geological seal that separates the world above from whatever lies deeper still. A silent testament to a moment when the land was scoured clean by forces that left no other trace. The significance of this discovery lies not in what the clay contains, but in what it so profoundly lacks. There are no pottery shards, no charcoal from ancient hearths, no discarded tools, no fragments of bone. It is a sterile void, an archaeological ellipsis. For a depth of nearly 3 meters in some places, the narrative of human presence simply ceases. The accumulated evidence of life, of struggle, of building and rebuilding is gone, replaced by a deposit of fine silt that speaks only of water and time. The work of the archaeologist here is the work of a librarian cataloging a missing book. They document the empty space on the shelf, the gap in the sequence, the profound and unsettling absence. This layer is not just sediment, it is a boundary. It represents a full stop in the long sentence of human habitation, a silent earthen wall between two distinct epochs, between two different worlds. This physical silence finds a strange echo in another medium, not in the earth, but on tablets of baked clay stored in the climate-controlled stillness of distant archives. Here, under the low hum of ventilation systems, the work is not of the trowel, but of the eye. We move from the open air of the excavation to the contained quiet of a records room. The scribe, an ancient and anonymous presence, speaks through these objects. His concerns were not poetry or myth as we understand them, but order, sequence, and administration. The cuneiform impressions are small, precise, and repetitive. They are lists of harvests, of goods, of rulers, of years. The tone is dispassionate, bureaucratic. It is the voice of a civilization preoccupied with the act of recording itself, of fixing the world in a permanent, unchangeable ledger. This is where the second thread of our investigation begins, in the cold, hard data of the earliest written records. Among these ledgers is a document of a different scale, known to us as the Sumerian King List. It is not a story, but a formulaic transfer of power. Its language is stark, repetitive, and administrative. After the kingship descended from heaven, it begins. The kingship was in Eridu. It then lists the rulers of Eridu, one by one, followed by the number of years they reigned. Then, Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. The list continues in this manner, a dry and methodical accounting of dynasties and cities, each entry a testament to a system of order and succession. The scribe who compiled this was not creating a saga. He was documenting a sequence, establishing a chain of legitimacy that stretched back to the very origin of authority. The text's power lies in its unwavering, monotonous certainty, as if it were recording not memory, but an unassailable fact. And then, after chronicling the reigns of 8 kings across 5 cities for a total of 200 years, the scribe's dispassionate record-keeping makes a single, stark entry. The formula is broken. The transfer of power is interrupted by an event so total that it requires its own line in the ledger. The tablet does not offer a dramatic narrative or a lament. It simply states, with the same administrative finality as a change in dynasty, "Then the flood swept over." This is not the language of myth. It is the language of an accountant closing a book. It is a categorical statement, a line drawn across the page of history. After this entry, everything that came before is sealed away, relegated to a prior age. The flood is not presented as a story to be told, but as a historical and administrative demarcation point, the end of one complete cycle of existence. We are left, then, with 2 separate but strangely resonant pieces of evidence. In the deep earth beneath the oldest city, a thick, sterile layer of water-deposited clay, a physical void in the record of human life. And in the oldest of written chronicles, a single administrative line marking a definitive end to a long-established order. Then the flood swept over, a physical scar and a textual one. An archaeologist in a trench and a scribe in an archive, separated by 5 millennia, seem to point to the same profound rupture. We do not need to force a connection. We only need to observe. The ground falls silent at the same moment the written record declares a cataclysm. The question that emerges is not one of faith or myth, but of sequence and evidence. A question that quietly suggests the accepted timeline of our past may be resting on a fractured foundation. What is most unsettling is not the break itself, but what comes immediately after. In the archaeological layers directly above the sterile clay, and in the king lists immediately following the mention of the flood, civilization does not struggle to re-emerge. It appears. It arrives seemingly complete, possessing the fundamental blueprints of urban life. Complex agriculture, monumental architecture, sophisticated astronomy, and the machinery of law and administration, they all manifest without a clear, gradual period of development. It is less a rebirth and more a restoration, as if a system was being rebooted from a saved state. This sudden complexity is the great, unanswered question of our earliest history. Where did the knowledge come from? If the world was wiped clean, who preserved the template for its reconstruction? The record is silent on this, presenting the new beginning as a simple fact, without preface or explanation. The anomaly beneath Eridu is not an isolated case. As the archaeologist's work expands, a pattern begins to form. Similar flood deposits, geologically consistent and dated to the same broad time frame, have been documented at other foundational sites across Mesopotamia, at Shuruppak, at Uruk, at Kish. Core samples drilled from the Persian Gulf and the Black Sea tell a similar story of a sudden, dramatic rise in sea level. The quiet disturbance in a single trench becomes a regional signature of widespread, catastrophic inundation. The evidence is no longer a localized curiosity, but a recurring feature across the very landscape where civilization is said to have begun. The invisible antagonist, the silence in the record, is not a single missing page, but an entire chapter torn from the beginning of the book, its absence felt across a vast geographical area. To remain here, in the quiet of this inquiry, is to feel the weight of such questions. They are not comfortable. They do not resolve themselves with easy answers. They are like the low hum of distant machinery, a persistent frequency beneath the noise of accepted history. The evidence does not shout. It whispers. It asks us to look closer at the foundations, to consider the possibility of a narrative far older and more broken than the one we have been taught. There is a certain fellowship in this kind of watchfulness, a shared space for those who are not afraid of the silence between the layers or the gaps in the oldest lists. It is an acknowledgement that the most profound truths are not always found in what is present, but in the resonant and recurring shape of what is missing. We return to the scribe. His medium is clay, his tool a reed stylus. He works not in the half-light of a trench, but in the administered brightness of a temple complex or a palace archive. We must understand his purpose. He is not a poet. He is not a storyteller weaving cautionary tales for future generations. He is an administrator, a functionary of a system obsessed with order, with sequence, with the correct and unbroken chain of authority. His work is not meant to inspire awe, but to document fact. The tablets he produces are ledgers of reality, as his civilization understood it. And it is in this cold, bureaucratic function that we find the first, deepest crack in our own understanding of the past, for the facts he records are, to us, impossible. The Sumerian king list is our primary document. It is the spine of this early history, and we must examine its vertebrae one by one. After stating that kingship descended from heaven and was established in Eridu, the scribe begins his accounting. The first name is Alulim. The entry is simple, following a rigid formula that will be repeated time and again. It gives the name, the title, and the duration. Alulim became king. He ruled for 800 years. The number is delivered without emphasis. It is not presented as a feat or a miracle. It is an administrative fact, an entry in a column, no different from a tally of grain sacks or a census of livestock. The scale of the number is so vast it resists comprehension, yet the tone of its delivery is utterly mundane. The list continues, the formula unbroken. The second king of Eridu is named. Alalangar ruled for 36 years. The number grows larger, the period of time more inconceivable. Again, the scribe offers no explanation. He does not justify the figure or frame it within a mythological context. He simply records it and moves on. The power of the document lies in this relentless, dispassionate precision. We are not reading an epic. We are auditing a cosmic dynasty. The scribe's silence on the nature of these years is more profound than any elaborate description could ever be. He assumes the reader understands the context, that these numbers are self-evident. We are the outsiders, peering into a system whose fundamental metrics of time and existence are alien to our own. One must pause here, in the quiet of this ancient accounting. The air in the archive is still, the only sound the faint hum of climate control preserving these fragile records. Imagine the scribe, his hand moving with practiced efficiency across the damp clay. What was his world? What understanding of reality made a 3600-year reign a simple, recordable fact? To dismiss this as mere metaphor or symbolic exaggeration is to ignore the very form of the document. Metaphors are the language of poets. This is the language of a bureaucrat. It is a text that derives its authority from its meticulous, unadorned, and repetitive structure. We are faced with a choice. Either the scribe was recording fantasy in the driest, most administrative prose imaginable, or he was recording a history whose rules we have completely forgotten. The pattern of impossibility is not random. It is systematic. After Eridu falls, the kingship is taken to the city of Bad Tibira. Here, 3 kings are listed. Enmenlu-Ana, who ruled for 200 years. Enmengal-Ana, who ruled for 800 years. And Dumuzid, the shepherd, whose reign is given as 36 years. The numbers are not identical, but they belong to the same order of magnitude. They suggest a consistent, if incomprehensible, system of chronology. This is not the wild, inconsistent storytelling of oral myth. This is data. cold, structured, and profoundly strange data, entered into a ledger by a hand that did not tremble. The repetition across different cities and different rulers reinforces the sense that this is not an anomaly, but the standard operating procedure for history in the age before the flood. The scribe's precision extends to providing mathematical summaries, reinforcing the administrative nature of the text. After listing the kings of a city, he often provides a total. For Bad Tibira, the tablet states, 3 kings. They ruled for 108 Auzozaran years. This is the act of an accountant balancing a column, not a myth-maker weaving a tale. The presence of these totals is one of the most unsettling features of the list. It implies that these numbers were meant to be added, to be reconciled, to be part of a larger, coherent chronological framework. It is an act of closure and verification, a sign that this section of the record is complete and accurate according to the scribe's own standards. The strangeness is not just in the numbers themselves, but in the calm, mathematical certainty with which they are handled. The cumulative effect is staggering. Before the text makes its sharp, definitive break, it presents a complete and totaled summary of this entire epoch. 8 kings across 5 different cities, from Eridu to Shurupak. The scribe concludes this section with a final tally. 8 kings. They ruled for 200 years. He then draws a line, both literally and figuratively. This vast expanse of time, a period longer than our own species has been in its modern form, is presented as a closed and finished chapter of recorded history. It is a single unbroken dynasty of rule, documented, summarized, and filed away before the world was remade. The sheer scale of this recorded past dwarfs everything that is to come after, framing our own history as a mere footnote to a much larger, now drowned text. We can feel the weight of these records in the silence. The dust motes that dance in the single beam of light in a records room seem to move more slowly. Time itself feels suspended. These are not just artifacts. They are transmissions from a different state of being, a world with a different rhythm. To sit with them is to feel the immense pressure of forgotten millennia. The absence of context, of explanation, forces us into a state of pure observation. We can only witness the data as it is presented, and in that witnessing, the familiar architecture of our own historical understanding begins to feel less like solid ground and more like a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark, and immeasurable ocean of time. This pattern is not confined to Mesopotamia. We move from the Tigris and Euphrates to the Nile Valley and find a chilling echo. In the 3rd century BCE, an Egyptian priest and historian named Manetho compiled a comprehensive history of his country, the Egyptiaca. Like the Sumerian scribe, he drew upon ancient temple records, many of which are now lost to us. His work survives only in fragments, quoted by later historians. And like the king list, Manetho's history does not begin with the first mortal pharaoh, Menes. It begins in a much earlier time, an epoch he calls the Reign of the Gods, a period when divine beings ruled directly on the soil of Egypt. His account is not vague, it is specific, dynastic, and chronological. Manetho's list is structured with the same administrative logic as its Sumerian counterpart. He assigns specific reign lengths to these divine rulers, creating a coherent, if incredible, chronology. The god Ptah, he records, ruled for 9 Zoroastrian years. He was followed by Ra, who ruled for 1 Zoroastrian years, and then a succession of other gods, each with a specific and often vast period of dominion. The numbers differ from the Sumerian records, but the underlying principle is identical. History begins not with humanity, but with a long, stable period of non-human rule, meticulously documented with specific durations. 2 great cradles of civilization, ostensibly developing in isolation, chose to preface their own histories with the same inexplicable formula, recording impossibly long reigns from a time before their own recorded existence. Most intriguing in Manetho's account is the period that bridges the age of gods and the age of men. He describes a dynasty of beings he calls the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus. These figures are not gods, but they are clearly not mortal men in the conventional sense. They are presented as an intermediary ruling class, a transitional government that held power in the long twilight before the dawn of recorded pharaonic history. Manetho, with the characteristic precision of an ancient scribe, assigns a specific duration to their collective reign: 900 years. They are an administrative entity, a link in the chain of legitimacy, their function being to transmit the order of the gods into the hands of the first human kings. They are the memory of a structured, non-human authority. Pause for a moment. Observe the time on your device, the quality of light in your room. In this specific, measured moment of your own time, you are a witness to these records from another, an echo across millennia. If you feel compelled, mark this moment in the space below. A single timestamp, a quiet acknowledgement. It is a small ritual, a way of connecting our brief second to their unfathomable years, a recognition that we are listening to a message that has waited a long time in the silence. The act of receiving such information is its own form of preservation, a continuation of the scribe's work in a new medium, a new time. The echo is heard a third time in the records of Babylon. Here, the historian Berossus, another priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, compiled his own history from temple archives. He too describes the world before a great flood, and he too provides a list of kings who reigned during this period. His account details a succession of 10 kings, a number resonant with pre-flood patriarch lists in other traditions, and assigns them reigns of equally impossible length. The first king, Aloris, ruled for 36 Shoazozeran years. The last, Xisuthros, in whose time the flood came, ruled for 800 years. 3 separate civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, 3 different scribal traditions, all independently attesting to the same foundational structure. A lost epoch of immense duration, ruled by a specific number of kings, and terminated by a single, world-altering cataclysm. Berossus's account adds another critical detail, another function for these others. He records that during the reigns of these first kings, strange beings known as the Apkallu appeared from the Persian Gulf. They were described as civilized and knowledgeable, and their purpose was explicit: to teach humanity the foundations of civilization. They gave humans writing, law, geometry, and the principles of agriculture. They laid out the plans for the first temples. They were not gods to be worshipped, but instructors, a faculty of founders who delivered a complete curriculum for urban life. Their appearance in the record is functional, not mythological. They are the bearers of the operating system that would be installed in the cities that followed. We must reconsider the nature of what we call myth. These accounts, when stripped of our modern preconceptions, do not read like fables. They are not chaotic, poetic tales of creation born from the mists of a primitive imagination. They are, in their structure and their language, administrative documents. They are concerned with legitimacy, with sequence, with the orderly transfer of power and knowledge. The scribe, whether in Sumer or Egypt or Babylon, is not trying to explain the mysteries of the universe. He is trying to establish an unbroken chain of custody for civilization itself, tracing its ownership back to a foundational, authoritative source. The story he tells is that of a system, a highly organized and hierarchical order, that was in place long before the first human kings. This obsession with precision was not limited to time. The earliest texts from these cultures are filled with other forms of cold, technical data. They contain sophisticated astronomical observations, complex mathematical tables, and precise architectural plans for sacred structures that seem to encode geometric and geodetic knowledge far beyond what we assume they possessed. They contain lists of lands, of rivers, of the divisions of the world, all laid out with a surveyor's eye for order and measurement. This is the background radiation of a lost system of knowledge. It suggests that the impossibly long rains were not an isolated anomaly, but one component of a much larger and more complex framework of understanding. A complete model of the cosmos that was inherited, not invented. One returns to the quiet, patient work. To the archaeologist in the trench, carefully brushing away the earth that has buried this world. To the historian in the archive, leaning closer to decipher a faded line of cuneiform. Both are engaged in the same task, listening. They are listening for a signal beneath the noise of millennia. The evidence does not offer a clear voice or a simple narrative. Instead, it offers a persistent, recurring pattern of data that does not fit. It is the cold, hard, and repetitive documentation of a world that should not have existed, recorded by scribes who seem to have no doubt that it did. The dust they brush away is not just soil, it is the accumulated silence of an epic forgetting. And so, this act of our inquiry does not close with a conclusion, but with a question that has grown heavier with each new piece of evidence. The issue is no longer a simple matter of dismissing impossible numbers as fantasy. The consistency of the record across multiple foundational cultures demands a more serious consideration. Why would they all independently invent such a similar, and similarly strange, preamble to their own histories? What purpose did it serve to record with such administrative diligence a lost world of immense antiquity, governed by a succession of long-lived rulers and founded by non-human instructors? The question shifts. It is no longer about if they were recording something real, but about the nature of the reality they were so meticulously trying to preserve. The work of the archaeologist is often a descent, a journey downward through time. But there comes a point where the investigation must turn, moving not deeper, but wider. It becomes a work of correspondence, of comparison. The single trench at Eridu, with its sterile layer of clay, ceases to be an isolated anomaly and becomes a reference point, a single pin on a vast, undrawn map. The researcher rises from the dust of that one location, carrying its signature, and begins to search for echoes. The tools are no longer the trowel and the brush, but geological surveys, satellite imagery of ancient riverbeds, and deep-core drilling logs from forgotten corporate and academic archives. The search is no longer for an object, but for the recurrence of an absence, for a pattern written not in cuneiform, but in the very strata of the earth itself. The data, when it is gathered, arrives without fanfare. It is a series of coordinates, chemical analyses of soil samples, and stratigraphic charts filled with technical notations. From the ground beneath Kish, another ancient Sumerian city, reports confirm a similar deposit of clean, water-lane silt separating the earliest layers of settlement from what lies beneath. At Shuruppak, the city of the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra, the same geological scar is found, a thick band of sterile clay that interrupts the long story of human habitation. The work is slow, methodical, a patient collation of reports from decades of disparate excavations. The archaeologist does not need to connect the dots. The dots, viewed from a sufficient distance, begin to connect themselves. A picture emerges of a regional event, a catastrophic inundation that left a consistent physical trace across the entire Mesopotamian floodplain, the very heartland of the world's first known cities. This physical pattern is then carried from the field office back into the controlled stillness of the archive. Here, the comparison is not of soil, but of scripture and record. Replicas of clay tablets are laid out on a long, dark table under a single focused light. The Sumerian king list, with its stark declaration of the flood, rests beside the fragmented chronicles of other equally ancient civilizations. The researcher's hands move slowly, aligning texts separated by 1,000 years and 1,000 kilometers, looking not for shared words, but for a shared structure, a resonance in the deep architecture of their histories. This is not the work of a linguist, but of a pattern matcher, searching for the ghost of a single story told in multiple, long-dead languages. The air is heavy with the silence of forgotten words, and the weight of what they might mean when read together. We turn first to the Nile, to the records of ancient Egypt as preserved by the priest Manetho. Writing much later, but drawing from temple archives of immense antiquity, he compiled a history of his land that, like the Sumerian list, does not begin with the first mortal king. It begins in a remote epoch he calls the reign of the gods, the Neteru, who governed Egypt directly. His account is not a vague, mythological preamble. It is presented as a formal dynastic record. The god Ptah, he states, ruled for 9 Aeson years. Ra ruled for 1 Aehu, Shu for 700, Geb for 500. Each entry is a precise, numerical statement, an administrative log of a divine dynasty. The familiar pattern appears in a new context, a lost age of non-human sovereigns, their time on the throne measured in millennia, recorded with the dispassionate accuracy of a state accountant. Manetho's chronicle contains a further, stranger detail, a transitional period that bridges the time of the gods and the era of the first pharaoh, Menes. After the gods withdrew, he records, Egypt was ruled by a different order of beings, a group he names the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. These figures are not gods, but they are not mortal men either. They are an intermediary dynasty, a class of rulers whose function was to maintain the cosmic order on Earth until humanity was ready to assume control. Manetho, with the same scribal precision, assigns a specific and vast duration to their collective reign, 13,900 years. They are a constitutional anomaly, a documented transfer of power from a divine source to a human one, managed by a third party whose existence is recorded as a simple, chronological fact. The resonance between the records is now too clear to ignore. In Mesopotamia, a list of 8 kings rules for 200 years before a great flood resets the world. In Egypt, a divine dynasty rules for an almost equally vast period, followed by an intermediary order that governs for another 14 millennia before the first human pharaoh. 2 of the world's foundational civilizations, separated by a harsh and unforgiving desert, both chose to anchor their histories in the same extraordinary premise: that their origins lay not in the slow, uncertain evolution of human society, but in a direct, documented inheritance from a long-lost age of non-human rulers. The structure of the memory is the same, even if the names and numbers differ. It is a pattern that suggests a common source for a story that should not exist. To recognize a pattern of this magnitude is to step outside the familiar currents of history. It requires a certain quietude, a willingness to sit with uncomfortable data and resist the urge for immediate explanation. It is an act of observation that connects us, in this moment, to the scribe in his archive and the archaeologist in their trench. There is a community of thought that forms in these silent spaces of inquiry, a shared watchfulness across the centuries. Those who remain here, listening to these faint, recurring signals, are part of a tradition that honors the question above the answer. It is a recognition that the deepest truths are not always proclaimed, but are sometimes found whispering in the echoes between seemingly unrelated records. The echo sounds a third time, now from the ruins of Babylon. Here, in the 3rd century BCE, a priest of Marduk named Berossus compiled a history of his own people, drawing, like Manetho, upon temple records that reached back into the mists of time. His work, the Babyloniaca, also begins with a world before a catastrophic flood, and he, too, presents a formal list of the kings who reigned during this antediluvian period. His list is composed of 10 rulers, a number that resonates with other ancient traditions of pre-flood patriarchs. Their reigns are, by now, predictably and impossibly long. The first king, Aloris, is said to have ruled for 36 Orzaran years. The last, Sisuthros, who was on the throne when the waters came, for 800 years. A third great civilization, a third independent attestation of the same foundational framework. Berossus, however, adds a new and critical layer to the pattern. He records that during the reign of the very first king, a group of beings appeared from the Persian Gulf. He calls them the Apkallu and describes them as annoying, a term often translated as repulsive or monstrous in their fish-like appearance, but their function was anything but. They were sages, instructors. Their purpose, as recorded by Berossus, was to teach humanity the complete blueprint for civilization. They delivered the arts of writing and mathematics. They taught the principles of law, of architecture, of land surveying, and of agriculture. They were not gods demanding worship, but a faculty of founders delivering a curriculum. They are presented as the bearers of a primordial knowledge, a complete operating system for urban life, given to humanity at the very dawn of this first age. We pause and let the light from the archival lamp fall across these three narratives at once: Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian. The pattern is no longer merely chronological. It has become functional. In Egypt, the Shemsu Hor act as a bridge, transmitting the divine order. In Babylon, the Apkallu arrive as instructors, delivering the tools of civilization directly. In both accounts, the memory is not simply of long-lived kings, but of a structured transfer of knowledge and authority from a non-human source to the first generations of humanity. The story is not about magic or divine whim, but about a system. It is the memory of a formal, almost bureaucratic process of establishment, a period of tutelage where the foundations of the world to come were deliberately and systematically laid out. The archaeologist in the trench feels this same pattern in a different medium. They are not reading texts, but are running a hand over the perfectly flat surface of a granite sarcophagus inside the Serapeum of Saqqara, or measuring the impossibly precise right angles of a foundation stone laid millennia before the invention of modern surveying equipment. They see the effect, the material residue of a knowledge that should not have existed. The skill is too advanced, the execution too flawless for a culture supposedly in its infancy. The technology appears in the record fully formed, without a long chain of trial and error leading up to it. The physical evidence on the ground mirrors the textual evidence from the archives. It speaks of an inheritance, of a sudden competence that seems to come from a source outside the established timeline of development. This is the central contradiction. The geological record shows a profound rupture, a slate wiped clean. The archaeological record shows that what came after this rupture was not a primitive struggle for survival, but a sudden and sophisticated blossoming of complex civilization. The textual records, when read as administrative history rather than myth, provide a potential explanation for this contradiction. They speak of a surviving knowledge, a blueprint for civilization carried across the rupture by a group of founders, the Shemsu Hor, the Apkallu, who oversaw its re-implementation. But this only pushes the mystery one step further back. It explains where Sumer and Egypt may have gotten their knowledge, but it says nothing of the world that produced such knowledge in the first place. The wind moves across the excavation site, kicking up a fine dust that seems to coat everything. It is the dust of millennia, the particles of empires ground down to nothing. Looking out from the edge of the trench, the world seems simple, a landscape of sand and sky. But beneath the surface, the neat lines of history begin to blur. The evidence does not point to a simple linear progression from primitive to advanced. It points to a cycle. It suggests a story of loss and recovery, of a great forgetting and a partial painful remembrance. The silence that emanates from the sterile layer of clay is not an empty silence. It is the sound of a great library that has been burned, with only a few scattered singed pages left to tell us that it ever existed. The pattern is now clear. A physical scar of a great flood, found across the ancient world. a textual memory of the same event, preserved independently by the first great civilizations, a shared historical structure of a lost golden age, ruled by beings of immense longevity, and a functional memory of a transfer of knowledge, of a systematic reboot of civilization by a group of intermediary founders. These are not isolated curiosities. They are repeating, interlocking pieces of a single, colossal puzzle. They are the faint but persistent outline of a world that lies buried, not just under the soil of Mesopotamia, but under the foundations of our entire understanding of the past. The work of the archaeologist and the archivist converge here. One holds a piece of clay from a sterile flood deposit. The other holds a tablet describing the end of a 200-year-old kingdom. Both are artifacts of the same event. Both are evidence of the great, invisible antagonist, the erasure of a world. The scale of this absence is difficult to comprehend. It suggests that what we call history is not the beginning of the story, but perhaps only its final and most recent chapter. The light in the archive seems to dim, not from a lack of power, but from the immense shadow cast by this emerging, forgotten timeline. The implications of this recurring pattern are profound. To accept it is to accept that the first lights of civilization in Sumer and Egypt were not sparks in a primordial darkness, but rather embers from a much older and far greater fire. It reframes our ancestors not as inventors, but as inheritors, perhaps even as survivors. They were the custodians of a fragmented memory, attempting to rebuild a world from a set of faded, half-forgotten blueprints. The administrative precision of their earliest records, their obsession with lists and sequences and legitimacy, suddenly makes a different kind of sense. It was the act of a people desperately trying to hold on to the last vestiges of a perfect, foundational order they knew they had not created themselves. We are left standing at a new threshold. The question is no longer whether a single strange text can be believed, or if a single layer of clay is significant. The inquiry has moved beyond the specific to the systemic. We are now faced with a coherent cross-cultural body of evidence that points to a single, shared memory of a predecessor civilization, a forgotten mother culture to the ancient world. The work from this point forward is not to prove its existence with a single artifact, but to trace the faint, structural echoes of its order, its knowledge, and its catastrophic demise through the civilizations that rose from its ashes. The story is no longer about a lost city, but about a lost chapter of the human journey. And so, this act of our investigation concludes not with an answer, but with a far more focused and disturbing question. We have established a pattern of evidence, geological, chronological, and functional, that is too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. It points to a global civilization that existed in deep antiquity and was destroyed by a worldwide cataclysm. The question that now hangs in the silent air of the archive, in the dusty wind of the excavation, is this: who were they? What was the nature of this buried order? And what parts of their forgotten world, what fragments of their knowledge and their power, survived the great forgetting to become the foundation of our own? The records fall silent on the matter of the flood itself. It is a demarcation, not a destination. But as we read past that stark, dividing line, a new question emerges from the administrative quiet of the texts. The scribe, having closed the book on one world, begins to document the next. And in doing so, he populates the dawn of this new age with figures who do not seem to belong to it. They are not the survivors of the cataclysm, struggling to rebuild from nothing. They are something else entirely. They are presented in the ledgers of the past not as gods of creation or spirits of nature, but as functionaries in a great and ancient hierarchy. Their presence is the most unsettling feature of this post-Diluvian world, for they are remembered not for their divinity, but for their work. We return to the Sumerian king list. Its first line, so often read as poetry, must be re-examined as a statement of process. After the kingship descended from heaven, it begins, This is not a metaphor for divine inspiration. In the administrative language of the scribe, it is a statement of origin and transfer. The very concept of ordered rule, the operating system of the state, is recorded as an import, a technology delivered from an external source. The first kings of the New Age are not revolutionaries who forged a new order. They are the first recipients of a pre-existing franchise. The scribe is not telling a story of invention, but of installation. The authority is not earned, it is received, fully formed, from a source the text simply labels heaven. This concept of an external foundational source is not an abstraction. The records of Babylon, as compiled by the priest Berossus, give it a name and a function. He speaks of the Apkallu, 7 sages who appeared in the first days after the flood. They are not described as gods to be worshipped, but as instructors with a specific curriculum. Their purpose, recorded with startling clarity, was to give humanity the complete blueprint for civilization. They taught the arts of writing, the principles of law, the methods of agriculture, and the complex geometry required for architecture and the surveying of land. They are remembered as a founding faculty, the bearers of a lost world's knowledge, tasked with its systematic re-implementation among the survivors. One must pause and consider the nature of this recorded memory. It is not a story of a slow human struggle toward enlightenment. It is a memory of tutelage. The Apkallu are presented as a temporary, specialized task force. They arrive, they deliver the data packet of civilization, and then they disappear from the record. Their role is purely functional. The scribe does not preserve hymns to their glory or lamentations for their departure. He simply notes their work. They were the agents of a great restoration, the technicians who rebooted a crashed system. Their strangeness lies not in their supposed fish-like appearance, but in the cold, corporate efficiency of their documented mission. The same functional pattern appears in the records of the Nile Valley. Manetho's history does not jump directly from the Age of Gods to the first mortal pharaoh. He inserts an intermediary period, a long dynasty of rulers he calls the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus. They are not gods, but they are not yet men. Their function is one of stewardship. They are a caretaker government, a regency council tasked with maintaining the divine order on earth until humanity is ready to assume the throne. They are not innovators, they are preservers. The very name, followers, implies adherence to a pre-existing code, a set of directives handed down from a higher authority. Their reign is a long, stable period of administrative continuity. In these records, we see the emergence of a clear hierarchy. The others are not a homogeneous group of divine beings. They are a structured organization with different roles and responsibilities. At the top are the great gods or kings of the antediluvian age, figures of immense authority and longevity who represent the source of the order. Below them are the functionaries, the field agents, the Apkallu who act as instructors, the Shem-Su-Hor who serve as administrators, and below them is humanity, positioned in these texts as the pupils, the inheritors, the subjects of this grand, systematic project of civilizational transfer. The story being told is not one of myth, but of a vast and ancient bureaucracy. The work of these beings, as recorded, is consistently practical. They are associated with the founding of the first sacred cities, but these cities are described as instruments of cosmic order, designed according to divine plans. They are credited with measuring the heavens, charting the movements of the stars, and establishing the calendar. These are the tasks of astronomers, surveyors, and engineers. They are remembered for digging the first canals, establishing the first legal codes, and setting the first boundaries for fields and territories. They are the original legislators and urban planners. Their divinity is expressed not through miracles, but through a profound and systematic application of knowledge. The silence in the texts is as revealing as the words themselves. The scribe does not question the origin of these beings. He does not speculate on their nature. Their existence is treated as a given, a self-evident part of the historical process. This lack of curiosity is perhaps the most alien aspect of the entire record. It suggests that, for the civilizations of Sumer and Egypt, the presence of non-human administrators at the dawn of their history was not a matter of faith, but a simple, foundational fact, no more remarkable than the rising of the sun. The mystery is not theirs, it is ours. We are the ones who have forgotten the context that made their presence logical. We must observe how these figures are approached in the texts. The tone is not one of intimate, emotional worship. It is one of profound and often fearful respect for authority. They are the ultimate source of legitimacy. The mortal kings who follow them derive their right to rule not from their own power, but from their claimed connection to this primordial, non-human order. The pharaoh is the heir of Horus. The Sumerian king is the chosen shepherd of the gods. Their entire political and religious structure is an attempt to replicate and maintain the perfect foundational system that was established at the beginning of time by these others. The archive room grows colder. The single light on the table seems to isolate these ancient tablets from the modern world. To read them this way is to feel a profound sense of dislocation. We have been trained to see these figures as symbols, as poetic personifications of natural forces. But the scribe, in his relentless administrative prose, resists this interpretation. He does not write of the god of the wind or the spirit of the river. He writes of Enlil, the cosmic legislator who assigned functions and territories, or of Thoth, the divine archivist who kept the records of the gods. They are not metaphors. They are executives. This functional interpretation shifts our entire understanding of their legacy. Perhaps the great megalithic structures they are said to have designed were not built for worship in our sense of the word. Perhaps they were instruments, tools for stabilizing the planet, for charting the heavens, for preserving knowledge. The pyramids cease to be mere tombs and become something else. Power plants, harmonic resonators, archives of a lost science, built according to a blueprint left behind by the original engineers. The function is the key. The records compel us to ask not what these structures meant, but what they did. The dust in the air seems to carry the weight of this re-evaluation. Every artifact, every text, must be seen again through this new lens. The intricate patterns on a cylinder seal are not just decoration. They may be schematics. The repetitive hymns are not just praise. They may be technical incantations, formulas for operating a forgotten technology. The others are not just a strange preamble to human history. They are the missing variable, the invisible cause whose effects are everywhere in the archaeological record. From the impossible precision of a granite box to the sudden, explosive complexity of the first written languages. Their presence explains the great contradiction that lies at the heart of our origins. It explains how civilization could appear so suddenly, so completely, from the mud of a world supposedly wiped clean. It was not a birth, but a transplant. The knowledge was not developed, it was delivered. The first cities were not experiments. They were constructed according to a pre-existing plan. The others are the answer to the question of the missing developmental phase. They are the memory of the architects who brought the blueprints with them across the great divide of the cataclysm. But this explanation only serves to deepen the mystery. It provides a function for these beings, but it tells us nothing of their origin. Who were the members of this ancient cosmic bureaucracy? From what world, what state of being did they come? The scribe is silent on this point. He records their arrival, their work, and their eventual withdrawal, but he does not provide a return address. They are a cause without a source, a solution that introduces an even greater and more profound enigma into the equation of our past. They are the ghost in the machine of history. Their function was to build the stage, to write the opening scenes, and to place the first human actors upon it. Once the play was in motion, they retreated into the wings, their work complete. But their presence lingers. It is felt in the foundational codes of our laws, in the celestial alignments of our oldest temples, and in the persistent, cross-cultural memory of a golden age when the world was governed directly by a superior, non-human intelligence. They are the ultimate invisible antagonist, for their very existence suggests that the story of humanity is not, and has never been, entirely our own. And so we are left in the quiet of the archive, surrounded by the records of their work. We have their titles, their job descriptions, the minutes of their meetings preserved in stone and clay. We have everything but an understanding of the organization they served. The others were not the source of the power. They were its agents. They were the visible functionaries of a much larger and now almost entirely invisible structure. The records of their actions are not the final answer. They are merely a table of contents for a library that has been lost, a library that told the story of the buried order itself. The archaeologist's work now changes. It is no longer a matter of simple excavation, of removing earth to reveal what lies beneath. The focus shifts to the boundary itself, the precise line where the world of men meets the sterile silence of the clay. Under the focused beam of the worklight, the transition is seen to be unnervingly sharp. There is no gradual mixing of layers, no slow petering out of human activity. One layer filled with the detritus of life, charcoal, bone fragments, the ghosts of reed huts, simply ends. And immediately below it, the clean, uniform silt begins. It is not a geological transition. It is a surgical incision. The earth here does not tell a story of decline and fall. It records a full stop, an instantaneous and total cessation. The investigation is no longer about an event, but about the nature of the wound it left in the timeline of the ground. This wound is not just deep. Its duration is unknown. The sterile layer of clay represents a period of non-deposition, a time when the slow, patient accumulation of history ceased. For how long? The sediment itself cannot tell us. It records only the event of its own arrival and the long, quiet period that followed. It is a gap, an unquantifiable ellipsis in the chronicle of the earth. It could be 100 years, or it could be 1,000. During this interval, the record is blank. No human hands built fires, no potters discarded their mistakes. No lives were lived or lost in a way that would leave a trace. This silence in the soil is absolute. It is the physical manifestation of the invisible antagonist, a chapter of time torn from the book of the world, leaving behind only a smooth, featureless scar where the story used to be. The profound strangeness intensifies when the archaeologist's gaze moves upward, to the very first layer of settlement directly atop the sterile clay. Here, civilization does not struggle to be reborn. It arrives fully formed. The pottery is sophisticated, kiln-fired, and decorated with complex geometric patterns. The metallurgy shows an understanding of alloying that has no precedent in the layers far below the flood deposit. The foundations of the buildings are laid with a precision that speaks of established architectural principles. The developmental phase is simply not there. The slow, clumsy process of trial and error, the hallmark of any true genesis, is absent. It is as if the survivors of the cataclysm did not have to reinvent the tools of civilization because they arrived with the blueprints already in hand. This is the silence of the missing apprentice. The evidence on the ground presents us with a gallery of masterpieces, but no sketches, no practice pieces, no failed experiments. We see the work of a master craftsman, but we can find no record of his training. This absence of a learning curve is one of the most persistent and unsettling problems in the archaeology of our oldest cultures. Knowledge does not appear this way. Skills are not born at this level of complexity. The presence of such sudden sophistication is a powerful argument, not for the genius of the builders, but for the existence of a source, a library of inherited knowledge from which they drew. The silence, in this case, is the sound of a question that the artifacts themselves refuse to answer. Where did the knowledge come from? The same structural gap echoes in the cool, quiet archives, on the surface of the clay tablets. The scribe, our dispassionate guide, documents the world after the flood with the same methodical precision he used for the world before. The kingship, he notes, is re-established, this time in the city of Kish. But the fundamental nature of that kingship has been irrevocably altered. The reigns are no longer measured in millennia, but in centuries, and soon, in decades. They become human. Yet the scribe offers no commentary on this staggering change. He does not explain why the very fabric of time and power seems to have been rewoven. He simply records the new, diminished reality as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The transition, the explanation for this cosmic demotion, is completely absent from his ledger. This pattern of narrative erasure extends to the fate of the others. The Apkallu, the 7 sages of Babylon, arrive from the sea, deliver the complete curriculum of civilization, and then they vanish from the record. Their mission is documented. Their origin and their destiny are not. The Shemsu-Hor of Egypt rule for nearly 14,000 years, acting as a bridge between the gods and men, and then they cede power and disappear into the footnotes of history. The scribe records their function, their job title in the grand cosmic bureaucracy, but provides no forwarding address. Their story is a fragment, a cameo appearance by a group of beings who seem to have founded our world and then quietly taken their leave. The silence surrounding their departure is as profound as the silence surrounding their arrival. One must pause here and consider the character of this pervasive silence. It is not the gentle, fading memory of a distant past. It feels structural, almost intentional. The missing time in the geological record, the missing developmental phase in the technological record, and the missing context in the textual record, they all align with a terrifying precision. They are gaps that appear at the most critical junctures of the story, obscuring the very origins we seek to understand. The invisible antagonist is not simply the passage of time. It is an active, systematic process of erasure. It is the silence of a redacted document, where the most important sentences have been deliberately blacked out, leaving us to guess at the meaning of the words that remain. Take a moment now. Look away from the screen and listen to the silence of the space you are in. What is not being said? What presence is defined by its absence? In the comments below, simply write the word silence and the time you are watching. Let us create a record of these quiet intervals, a small archive of the moments we spent acknowledging what is missing. It is a small ritual, a shared act of witness to the great silent antagonist that stands at the center of this inquiry. In this collection of recorded silences, we join a long tradition of listening for the echo of what has been lost. The evidence for this deliberate erasure is not merely conceptual, it is carved in stone. At Göbekli Tepe, a vast and impossibly ancient temple complex in modern-day Turkey, we find a mystery that is not one of creation, but of burial. Dated to nearly 12,000 years ago, a time when humanity was thought to be nothing more than scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, this site displays a stunning sophistication in its art and architecture. Yet its most profound secret is that its creators, for reasons we cannot fathom, deliberately and meticulously buried their own masterpiece. They interred their sacred pillars and ritual spaces under thousands of tons of earth, preserving it in a silent tomb of their own making. This was not an act of destruction, but an act of concealment, a self-erasure on a monumental scale. This strange impulse to hide, to bury, to seal away, is not unique to Göbekli Tepe. We see echoes of it across the ancient world. Many sacred sites, from the megalithic chambers of Western Europe to the subterranean complexes of the Mediterranean, show signs of being ritually decommissioned and sealed. This suggests a culture, or a tradition, that was not trying to broadcast its achievements to the future, but to hide them from it. It is the behavior of a people who possess a dangerous knowledge, a sacred inheritance that they believe the coming ages will not be ready for. or will misuse. The silence, in this context, is not an absence of information, but a deliberate shield, a quarantine placed around a power that was deemed too great for a fallen world. The antagonist wears another mask in the Indus Valley. Here, a civilization as vast and as organized as those of Egypt and Mesopotamia flourished for more than 1,000 years. They built great cities of baked brick, with sophisticated sanitation systems and a rigidly planned grid layout. And they possessed a written language, thousands of examples of which have survived on small stone seals and copper tablets. We can see their words, the elegant, enigmatic symbols they used to record their world, but we cannot hear their voice. The Indus script remains undeciphered, a lock for which we have no key. An entire civilization, with its history, its beliefs, its literature, is mute. The silence here is one of non-comprehension, a message in a bottle that has arrived on our shore with its contents written in an ink that has become invisible to our eyes. The silence of origins is perhaps the most profound of all. The ancient texts are willing to tell us what the others did, but not who they were. The Apkallu came from the sea, a statement of direction, not of origin. The Shemsu Hor are the followers of Horus, a title that describes their allegiance, not their nature. These beings enter the record as fully formed entities with a clear and specific mission. They are presented without a genealogy, without a homeland, without a history of their own. Their entire existence, as far as the scribe is concerned, is defined by their interaction with humanity. Their own world, their own culture, their own story, remains completely and totally absent from the record. They are a cause without a source, a faculty without a university. We must also confront the known destruction. The silence we are investigating is not just a matter of what wasn't recorded, but of what was actively destroyed. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous scar, but it is just one wound among thousands. Throughout history, conquering armies and zealous ideologues have targeted the libraries and archives of their enemies. They knew that to control the future, you must first erase the past. We are working with the surviving fragments of a library that has been systematically looted and burned for millennia. The antagonist, in this form, is the censor's fire, the soldier's torch. We are not just trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. We are trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces we know were deliberately and violently cast into the flames. History does not flow like a river. It moves in fits and starts, punctuated by long, silent falls into darkness. The great empires of the Bronze Age, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Minoans on Crete, did not decline gracefully. They collapsed. Within a single generation, their great cities were abandoned, their trade networks dissolved, their written languages forgotten. These dark ages are profound gaps in the historical record, periods of systemic collapse where complex societies seem to vanish, leaving behind only ruins and a cultural silence that can last for centuries. These recurring societal deaths are the rhythmic pulse of the antagonist, a heartbeat of erasure that echoes down through the ages, reminding us that civilization is a fragile, temporary island in a vast ocean of forgotten time. We return, finally, to the silence of the scribe himself. His greatest omission is his own curiosity. He records reigns that last for tens of thousands of years, but never pauses to explain how this could be so. He documents the arrival of non-human teachers who carry the blueprint of civilization, but never asks them where they came from. This professional, almost inhuman detachment is itself a form of silence. It is the silence of a functionary who is not paid to ask questions, but only to copy the authorized text. His lack of inquiry suggests that the story was already old, already edited, already stripped of its context and its controversy, long before it reached his stylus. He is not the author of the silence. He is its final, most faithful transmitter. The ultimate achievement of this invisible antagonist is the erasure of a name. We have been forced to give this forgotten world a label, the buried order, but the records themselves provide none. It exists only in relation to what came after, the time before the flood, the age of the gods. It is a past defined only by its termination. It is a people without a name, an empire without a gazetteer, a culture whose own identity has been so completely scoured from the memory of the world that it can only be described as an absence. The antagonist has not just won the war, it has erased any record that the war ever took place. The pattern is now unmistakable. The silence is not random, nor is it a simple artifact of time's decay. It is targeted. It is a void that is shaped and defined, appearing with surgical precision around the most fundamental questions: the origin of knowledge, the nature of the predecessors, the cause of the great cataclysm, and the mechanics of the subsequent reboot. The very information that would solve the puzzle is the information that has been most systematically removed. This is not a case of a lost history. This is a case of a censored one. The silence is not an accident. It is a monument, the last and most enduring structure built by this forgotten order, a testament to the totality of their fall and the terrible power of what they knew. We are left here, in the deepening quiet, surrounded by the evidence of a story that is told primarily through its missing parts. The archaeological trench has become a wound. The ancient tablet has become a redacted document. The entire field of our inquiry has shifted. The work is no longer about the search for an object or a text that will provide the final answer. The work is now to learn to read the silence itself. It is not an obstacle to be overcome, but the central artifact to be studied. It is the final, and perhaps the only authentic message that has survived the wreck of that former world. A profound and carefully constructed void. We have followed the threads of evidence to this quiet, contemplative space. On one hand, the physical record, a sterile layer of clay beneath the world's first cities, a geological scar marking a profound and total rupture. On the other, the textual record, the administrative lists of Sumer, Egypt, and Babylon, all attesting with dispassionate precision to a lost epoch of immense duration, governed by non-human kings and terminated by the same catastrophic flood. And binding them together, the most persistent evidence of all, the silence. A systematic absence of developmental phases, of context, of explanation. A void that appears precisely where the most critical answers should be. We are not looking at a collection of unrelated anomalies. We are looking at the interlocking components of a single, coherent, and deeply unsettling message. The standard model of history, the one that tells a simple, linear story of progress from primitive hunter-gatherer to sophisticated urbanite, cannot accommodate this data. That model requires a slow, gradual accumulation of knowledge, a long and visible period of trial and error. But the evidence we have gathered points to the exact opposite. It shows a sudden, explosive arrival of a complete civilizational package: advanced mathematics, monumental architecture, complex astronomy, and codified law, appearing fully formed on the far side of a catastrophic boundary. The conventional narrative has no room for this. It cannot explain the missing learning curve. The pattern we have observed is not an exception to the rule. It is a fundamental challenge to the rule itself, suggesting the map we have been given is missing an entire continent. We must pause and consider the nature of this challenge. It does not come in the form of a single, unambiguous artifact. There is no buried machine, no golden tablet that spells out the truth in plain language. The evidence is more subtle, and perhaps more powerful for it. It is a resonance, a structural echo. It is the way the sharp, sterile line in the earth beneath Eridu mirrors the sharp, administrative line on the Sumerian king list. It is the way the functional description of the Apkallu in Babylon harmonizes with the role of the Shemsu Hor in Egypt. To perceive this requires a different kind of seeing, a willingness to listen not for a single voice, but for a chord that is being played across millennia, on instruments of clay, stone, and sediment. What if we have been reading the story from the wrong direction? We have been taught to see Sumer and Egypt as a beginning, the dawn of human potential. But what if the evidence compels us to see them as an end? The end of a long, painful process of forgetting. What if these first great civilizations were not an invention, but an inheritance, the work of survivors, not pioneers? This single shift in perspective realigns every piece of evidence we have examined. The sudden sophistication is no longer a mystery. It is the signature of a legacy. The focus on preserving ancient knowledge is no longer a quirk. It is the prime directive of a culture founded on the memory of what was lost. This reframes the entire post-Diluvian project as an act of recovery. It was not a creation, but a restoration, a desperate attempt to reboot a crashed and corrupted system from a few surviving fragments of its source code. The others, the Apkallu, the Shemsu Hor, cease to be gods or mythical beings and become something far more tangible, the technicians of this great restoration. They were the bearers of the backup data, the instructors tasked with overseeing the reinstallation of the core principles of civilization among a traumatized and diminished humanity. Their work was not one of magic, but of methodical, painstaking reconstruction according to a pre-existing blueprint. This hypothesis illuminates the strange, dispassionate character of the earliest records. Why the obsession with lists, with sequences, with the unbroken chain of legitimacy? Because if you are the custodian of a fragile, inherited order, your primary duty is not to innovate, but to preserve. You are a curator, not an artist. The scribe's cold, administrative tone is the natural voice of a bureaucracy whose entire purpose is to perfectly replicate a lost Golden Age system. They were not writing myths. They were copying a manual, desperately trying to get the sequence right, terrified that any deviation would lead to another system failure, another collapse into the chaos from which they had just emerged. And if this is true, then the scale of the world that was lost defies our modern imagination. The knowledge system that collapsed must have been of an extraordinary sophistication, powerful enough to provide the complete operating system for not one, but multiple distinct successor civilizations across the globe. The buried order was not a loose confederation of proto-cities. The consistency of the inherited pattern suggests it was something far more integrated, a cohesive global network of knowledge, and perhaps of power. The cataclysm was not the destruction of a city. It was the shattering of a world, a single, interconnected system whose fall was so complete that its very existence was almost erased from memory. The implication extends to the physical world, to the stones themselves. The impossible precision of the earliest megalithic structures, the celestial alignments that track astronomical cycles over tens of thousands of years, these cease to be inexplicable anomalies. They become relics. They are the surviving hardware of this forgotten predecessor civilization, the silent stone machines whose original function was perhaps only dimly understood by the inheritors who built their new world among the ruins. The knowledge of how to build them may have survived the flood, but the understanding of what they were for, the science they embodied, was largely lost in the great forgetting. This framework compels us to see the world differently. The consistency of the foundational myths, the flood, the civilizer gods, the Golden Age, is no longer a coincidence of the primitive mind. It is the fragmented, distorted but globally consistent memory of a single, shared historical trauma. The buried order was not a Mesopotamian or an Egyptian phenomenon. The echoes in the Americas, in the Indus Valley, in the submerged landscapes of the North Sea, all suggest a planetary culture, a human story that was once unified before it was shattered into the mosaic of competing tribes and nations that we call history. The flood did not just drown the land, it drowned a world of interconnected thought. We stand then at a conceptual precipice. To accept this implication is to fundamentally alter our position in the timeline of human existence. The story is no longer one of a simple, triumphant ascent from the cave to the cosmos. It becomes a cyclical tragedy. We are not the first to reach these heights. We are merely the latest iteration in a long and perhaps repeating story of rise, fall, and painful rebirth. This does not diminish our achievements, but it places them in a much larger and far more humbling context. It suggests that the great challenge of civilization is not innovation, but memory. The struggle is not to create the new, but to avoid forgetting the old. This investigation is not a single narrative that concludes here. It is a path that continues into a landscape of ever-deepening questions. To follow it requires a certain kind of patience, a commitment to listening for signals that have been traveling for a very long time. If you find yourself drawn to this quiet, sustained work of listening, know that your attention is part of the process itself. Let it be known that you are still here, still watching, still questioning. The next step on this path does not lead to an answer, but deeper into the architecture of the silence itself. The true cataclysm, then, was not the water. The flood was merely the physical mechanism for a far more profound event, a species-wide amnesia. The real disaster was the loss of context, the severing of the connection to the source of knowledge. The civilizations that emerged in the aftermath were built by the children of amnesiacs, haunted by the ghost of a world they could remember only in the form of fragmented myths and half-understood rituals. Their great temples were attempts to reverse-engineer a forgotten science. Their sacred texts were attempts to reconstruct a library whose contents had been burned. This casts the others in a new and tragic light. They were not gods in the sense we understand. Perhaps they were the last survivors of the old order, the custodians of its archives, engaged in a desperate, long-term project to salvage what they could from the wreck of their world. Their divinity in the eyes of early humanity was simply the reflection of their immense and now lost knowledge. They were the lonely librarians at the end of time, trying to teach the alphabet to a world that had forgotten how to read, knowing that they themselves, and the world they came from, would soon be forgotten too. And the invisible antagonist, the silence, the erasure, reveals its true character. It is not a passive void created by the decay of time. It is an active and perhaps deliberate consequence of the collapse. The meticulous burial of a site like Göbekli Tepe is no longer an enigma. It can be seen as an act of quarantine. It is the behavior of a people who understood that their knowledge was a double-edged sword, a power too dangerous for a fractured and immature world. The silence was a shield, a final, desperate act of responsibility by the last members of the buried order to protect the future from the very knowledge that may have led to their own destruction. The mystery has now expanded beyond the confines of this single inquiry. It is no longer a question of a lost civilization buried beneath the Mesopotamian sands. It has become a question about the fundamental nature of our own. It suggests that our entire recorded history is but a thin, fragile surface layer, and that beneath it lies a vast, unmapped continent of human experience. The story we have been telling ourselves about who we are and where we came from may be nothing more than the final chapter of a much longer and far more significant book. The recovery of that lost text would not just add a new chapter to history, it would force us to redefine what it means to be human. We are left on the shore of this immense ocean of time. The familiar landmarks of history have receded behind us, and before us lies a horizon defined only by the scale of what is unknown. The evidence does not provide a destination, a final truth to be possessed. Instead, it offers a new direction for our gaze, downward, into the deep, silent archives of the earth and the human soul. The buried order is not a place to be found, but a presence to be acknowledged. It is the great, silent foundation upon which our own world is unknowingly built, a constant, resonant reminder that the most important parts of our story are the ones we have yet to remember. The light in the trench has been extinguished. The generator that powered it has fallen silent, and the small circle of excavated earth has been reclaimed by the vast, undifferentiated darkness of the desert night. The work is done, but the ground does not feel settled. The air itself, now cooling rapidly as heat radiates back into the star-filled sky, seems to hold a question. There is a stillness here that is more than the mere absence of sound. It is the weight of millennia pressing down on the thin layer of the present, a quiet that is heavy with the memory of all the words that were never recorded and all the lives that left no trace. The wind moves softly across the sand, a slow, patient breath that has been breathing since the first stone was laid and will continue long after the last one has turned to dust. We are left here, in this suspended time, with the final artifacts of our inquiry. They are not answers. They are objects of profound and unsettling silence. Consider a single, foundational stone from a pre-dynastic temple, now resting in the climate-controlled quiet of a museum vault. Its surface is perfectly flat, its angles impossibly true. It was shaped by hands that held a knowledge we do not fully understand, for a purpose we can only guess at. It does not speak of gods or kings. It speaks only of a mastery over the physical world that seems to have no precedent. To touch its cold, unyielding surface is to touch a thought that has been frozen for 10,000 years, a thought whose context has been utterly and completely lost. It is a monument not to a civilization, but to the silence that has consumed it. This stone is a physical fact. Beside it, in our consideration, we must place a textual one, a single clay tablet, perhaps a fragment of the king list. The cuneiform impressions are small, precise, and impersonal. They are the marks of an administrator, not a poet. The tablet does not offer wisdom or solace. It offers data, a name, a city, and a number so vast it dissolves into abstraction. Like the stone, the tablet is a product of a system, a piece of a much larger machine of order and record-keeping. And like the stone, its silence is its most powerful feature. It records an impossible history without feeling any need to explain it. It simply presents a fact and moves on, leaving us alone in the quiet of the archive to grapple with its implications. These remnants, the stone and the tablet, are what remain when the narrative recedes. They are the irreducible elements of the mystery. They are not clues to be solved, but objects to be contemplated. They sit outside our timeline, challenging its foundations with their quiet, stubborn existence. They are the evidence of a different kind of thinking, a different relationship with time, matter, and knowledge. They do not ask for our belief. They simply are, and in their being, they create a space, a deep and resonant void in our understanding of the past, a space into which all our questions now fall, echoing without end. Their survival is a testament to their own solid reality, and a constant physical rebuke to the simple story we have told ourselves about who we are. The journey we have taken has not been a line from a question to an answer. It has been a spiral, moving ever deeper into the architecture of the question itself. We began by asking if a civilization existed before Sumer. We now find ourselves asking if our entire conception of history is built upon a foundation of willed and catastrophic forgetting. The search was never for a specific place, a lost Atlantis buried beneath the waves. The search was for the shadow of a structure, the ghost of a system, a pattern of order that can still be faintly discerned in the oldest records and the deepest layers of the earth. The discovery is not a place, but a recognition that the silence at the dawn of history is not empty. It is the sound of a world that has been erased. And so, the work of the archaeologist and the archivist does not truly end. It merely changes its nature. The task is no longer to dig for new evidence, but to learn to inhabit the presence of the evidence we already have. It is to sit in the quiet of the museum after hours, under the single focused light, and to feel the weight of the impossible artifact before you. It is to stand at the edge of the trench in the pre-dawn cold, and to feel the immense, unrecorded depth of the time that lies sleeping beneath your feet. The work becomes a form of custodianship, a vigil kept for a memory that is not our own, but which we have somehow, through this inquiry, been made responsible for. We are the inheritors of a question that has been waiting for millennia to be asked in this way. The answer, if it exists, is not for us to find. Our role is a simpler one. It is to clear a space for the question to exist, to protect it from the noise of easy explanations and the comfort of established certainties. We are the curators of an anomaly, the librarians of a single, impossibly strange book that is missing its beginning, its middle, and its end, but whose surviving pages hint at a story far grander than any we have ever known. This act of quiet, sustained attention is the only true tribute we can pay to the immensity of what has been lost. The light is fading now, not from the desert, but from the inquiry itself. The narrator's voice, which has guided us through the dust of the archives and the silence of the trenches, begins to recede. It leaves us not with a conclusion, but with a lingering resonance. The purpose was never to provide a definitive map of this buried world. It was to lead you to its shore, to let you stand for a moment and look out upon the vast, dark ocean of its absence. The rest of the journey is one that must be taken in silence and alone. It is the journey inward, where the implications of this fractured history must find their own place in the landscape of your own understanding. What remains is not a theory, but a feeling. It is the quiet hum of a fundamental frequency beneath the noise of the world. It is the sense that the ground beneath our modern cities is not solid, but is a thin crust over a vast and unnavigated cavern of forgotten time. It is the recognition that we may be a species with amnesia, living among the ruins of a greatness we can no longer name, unconsciously repeating patterns and cycles that were set in motion long before our own recorded story began. This feeling is the final artifact, the one you are left to carry when the screen goes dark. The camera, in its final, slow movement, pulls away. It rises from the single dark ruin in the desert, climbing into the deep velvet of the night sky. The landscape resolves into a pattern of shadow and faint reflected starlight. Higher still, and the curve of the earth becomes visible, a faint, blue-lit arc against the infinite black. Then the lights of our own world begin to appear. Cities emerge as glowing, geometric webs, constellations of human order laid out across the continents. The highways that connect them are glowing threads, the trade routes of a global civilization that believes it is the first of its kind. The patterns are intricate, logical. They follow the contours of coastlines, the paths of rivers, the placement of natural resources. They seem to be the product of our own history, our own needs, our own ingenuity. But seen from this great and silent height, a final question hangs in the void. Are we certain that these patterns are entirely our own? Or are we, in the long, slow, and unknowing work of building our world, merely tracing the faint, spectral outline of a much older grid, the ghost of a forgotten map, the last silent legacy of the buried order? The image holds, a sphere of light and shadow, spinning slowly in an immense and patient silence. We are looking at a home we suddenly know less well than we did before. The web of lights is a testament to all that we have built. The darkness between them is a reminder of all that we have forgotten. The story does not end. It is simply where we stop telling it. The rest is the quiet work of listening to the silence that remains, and to the deep, slow rhythm of the world as it continues its long, cyclical journey through the night. The lights of the cities below seem to pulse, like a slow and steady heartbeat. Each one a center of knowledge, of life, of history as it is currently understood. But the darkness that surrounds them is not an absence. It is a presence. It is the ancient unlit earth, the deep water, the vast and silent majority of a planet that remembers everything and says nothing. The patterns we have created on its surface are so new, so fragile. They are a language written in a fleeting medium, while the true, enduring text lies beneath, carved in stone and sediment, waiting. We are left with this final, silent image. The Earth from a great distance, a beautiful and solitary vessel. It carries its deep history within it, a library of worlds buried beneath the one we see. The questions we have raised do not disturb its silent cosmic journey. They simply allow us, for a moment, to become aware of the true scale of the mystery we inhabit. The past is not behind us, it is beneath us. And we are, and have always been, living in the quiet and perhaps sacred shadow of its immense and now invisible ruins.